Hi, welcome.
Hey, how are you doing?
I'm doing wonderfully well. How are you doing?
I'm good. It's nice to see you.
It's nice to see you, and I'm so incredibly honored that you're here. Everybody, just allow me to take a minute and gush and introduce you to everyone. Um, Please join us for this conversation, everybody. This is a national treasure who we're speaking to today. This is the great poet and memoirist Natasha Trethewey. She is a Pulitzer Prize winning poet. She was twice in service to this country as our poet laureate, and she is the author of a beautiful and devastating new memoir that's called Memorial Drive. Um, and she is, I'm going to start crying before I even begin. we spoke a little bit yesterday, and we already kind of got started.
I
So
know, I know.
I just want to say, first of all, thank you. And writer to writer, thank you for this beautiful and devastating story that you've told. Um, this is a book for those of you who haven't yet read it. This is a story that Natasha has carried around and written about in various ways, circled and circles you, I think, for decades. And it's the true story of her mother's death through domestic violence at the hands of her stepfather when Natasha was 19 years old. This book begins with a dream.
It's already starting.
We can take, I know, it's already starting, and yesterday, I called you yesterday and we spoke about, I've been listening to interviews of you talking about this book, and I said, look, how do I serve you in this, and how do I be sensitive in this, and should we not talk about should we somehow talk about this book about your mother's murder and not talk about your mother's murder? Should we talk about craft instead? Should we talk about, and you said the most beautiful thing. You said that you're not afraid of the tears of grief, and that, it immediately made me smile and made me love you, because I thought, yeah, you can't be afraid of emotion and be a poet.
Right.
you know, you,
Right.
you just obviously can't be a poet and fear emotion. And one of the things that you and I were discussing briefly when we spoke yesterday was, you said it's so interesting that some people are afraid of this book because of the great sorrow and the great loss in the book.
Yeah.
And you said, it's so ironic because people love true crime, grisly murder mysteries so much. And I said, yeah, but people don't love true grief stories. And that is what this book is. It's an elegy, and it's a work of art. And it's, you wrote another book called Monument, but this is also a monument.
Yeah.
And I wanted to talk about the miracle that begins at where this story launches. So your mother was murdered by her partner, by your stepfather, over 30 years ago in Atlanta. And you write in the beginning of this book about the amount of time you spent as a young person actively, willfully forgetting, I think is the word, willfully forgetting in order to be able to survive. And yet writing about her and speaking about her as you went through your very storied, very lauded career as a poet. And this book begins with this incredible, strange, or the beginnings of this book happen because, quite by a random coincidental accident, you and your husband were eating or having drinks at a restaurant one night, and a man recognized you. And he was the first police officer who had been at the scene of the crime when your mother was killed. And he recognized you from decades earlier. And then another extraordinary coincidence, miracle, he said, I've got the files for your mother's case. Would you like them, because they're going to be destroyed soon? I can't get over this circumstance. And it reminds me of something I always think as a writer. One of the things that I feel as an artist is that when the story needs to be told, they'll tell you. And by they, I mean whoever it is that operates this world and this universe. And they'll say, okay, now. And I wondered if you had that moment of, if that's what it felt like to you when you met this gentleman, when he found out, when he wept, when he realized who you were, when you realized who he was. And then he gave you what Dwight Garner in the New York Times called dumping out a bag of dreadful receipts, essentially
Right.
just gave you this this package of horror, which is the story of your mother trying to get away from her abuser and almost getting away.
Mm-hmm.
So what how did you feel that that was a summons as an artist that it was time to tell this story?
You know, that's such an interesting thing, Liz, to start with, because right before we got on the our moment here, I was actually thinking about the opposite. I was thinking about the obstacles that are placed in the way of telling a story like this, whether it be like the fire that I had, in the middle of trying to do this, all of a sudden I have to deal with that huge trauma, and putting a life and a house back together. But then there's the obstacles that we put in front of ourselves, like forgetting, like not wanting to sit down and do the work of going there. And yet it seems that the universe kept telling me, this is the story that
Yeah.
you have to write. I can remember when my first book, Domestic Work, came out, I gave a reading from it. And that, that book, a big section of it is about my grandmother, my mother's mother. And after the reading, a man came up to me and said, you need to write about your mother. That's the story you need to write about. And it was the eeriest feeling because it felt like he knew the story. He knew something that I wasn't yet dealing with.
Mm.
So from the very beginning, I felt that the universe has been telling me this. But that moment of, serendipity, of running into the man the former police officer who was first on the scene, um, I could only have had something like that happen um, because I placed myself in the physical geography of.
Right, of Atlanta. And were you actually on Memorial Drive?
No, but I
When
was right at the restaurant is across the street from the courthouse
wow.
where the sentencing happened, where the initial trial for the first time he tried to kill her happened. So, I had put myself right back in that same proximity, um, moving toward it, I think, rather than moving away from it. Even as I swore I would never go back.
And here you are sitting in front of the courthouse.
Yeah, right
um,
there.
there's so many directions I want to go with that, but before I do, I wanted to see if you would read to us from the very first pages of Memorial
Sure.
Drive. And for those of you who are just joining us, and please don't miss this conversation with one of America's greatest living poets, Natasha Trethewey, and a great hero of mine. We're reading from her new memoir, Memorial Drive, and I think I gave you the pages yesterday, page 16. I wanted everybody to see where you come from as a woman who was born in Mississippi in the 60s to a white father and a black mother, and whose very existence was a crime, and
Right.
and who arrived at such a heated moment in American racial history, and now, of course, we're in another. And these words seem even more trenchant than perhaps when you wrote them. So, or maybe not. I'll let you decide that. But if you could read to us from that, it would be great. Thank you.
Thank you. In the spring of 1966, when I was born, my mother was a couple of months shy of her 22nd birthday. My father was out of town, traveling for work, so she made the short trip from my grandmother's house to Gulfport Memorial Hospital, as planned, without him. On her way to the segregated ward, she could not help but take in the tenor of the day, witnessing the barrage of rebel flags lining the streets, private citizens, lawmakers, Klansmen, often one and the same, raising them in Gulfport and small towns all across Mississippi. The 26th of April that year marked the 100th anniversary of Mississippi's celebration of Confederate Memorial Day, a holiday glorifying the Old South, the Lost Cause, and white supremacy. And much of the fervor was a display, too, in opposition to recent advancements in the civil rights movement. she could not have missed the paradox of my birth on that particular day. A child of miscegenation, an interracial marriage still illegal in Mississippi and as many as 20 other states. Sequestered on the colored floor, my mother knew the country was changing, but slowly. She had come of age in the summer of 1965, turning 21 in the wake of Bloody Sunday, the Watts riots, and years of racially motivated murders in Mississippi. Unlike my father, who'd grown up a white boy in rural Nova Scotia, hunting and fishing, free to roam the open woods, my mother had come into being a black girl in the deep South, hemmed in, bound to a world circumscribed by Jim Crow. Though my father believed in the idea of living dangerously, the necessity of taking risks, my mother had witnessed the necessity of dissembling, the art of making of one's face an inscrutable mask before whites who expected of blacks a servile deference.
Thank you, Natasha. That passage struck me for so many reasons. My sister was born in 1966 in Charleston, South Carolina.
Oh, yeah.
Neither of my parents were from the South, but my dad was in the Navy. I just want to contrast your birth to hers. My sister was born in a naval hospital. My mom's memories, her experiences of the South were polite people, friendly people, wonderful food, Spanish moss hanging from the trees, and a lot of love to her and her child. And my sister was born just a few months after you were. My mom was a nurse, and she was working in a hospital in the South. She was from Minnesota. She'd never experienced the South. And she was working in the maternity ward shortly after my sister was born, and she had to bring two babies down for a test, a black baby and a white baby, and she put them in the same cart and pushed them down the hallway together and was severely reprimanded. And it was, I point this out because it was the first time in her life that she had encountered racism. What white privilege means is that you can be 24 years old in America before you really have encountered racism.
Exactly.
And on that same year, you were being born into this family with such idealism. You know, one of the first things you were told as a child by both of your parents was that you were the best of both worlds. And yet with such terror. Crosses had been burned in your family's yard. Your mother, your grandmother, who I want to talk about more, had been a very brave activist. You and your family, on your mother's side of the family, never had the luxury of not knowing what racism was.
That's absolutely right, yeah.
Yeah, and I wondered if you could speak a little bit more about your Mississippi upbringing, and particularly about a quote I found of yours in another book, where you quoted Nina Simone saying, everybody knows about Mississippi. And I'm wondering if you can elaborate on that, because you are the third woman in this series of book interviews that I've done who is from Mississippi. Brittany Cooper is from Mississippi, and Emily Bernard is from Mississippi. We're going to have Jasmine Ward on in the next month. She's from Mississippi. Tell us what this is. I want to hear more about your.
Yeah, it was really fun to use that from Nina Simone's Mississippi Goddamn, of course, because and I tried to use it playfully because you know, she's saying it like everybody knows about Mississippi, and then that's when we get the line Mississippi Goddamn. So I wanted to not have that line, but I also wanted to suggest that there's a lot that we don't know about Mississippi. A lot that is hidden or buried or erased in Mississippi's history, which is why it's important that you know, people like Jasmine Ward or Emily Bernard tell the other stories about Mississippi that often go overlooked because they are buried. You know, that story about your mother encountering at 24 her first sort of taste of racism and what white privilege. I mean, my parents really, I could see that happening when I was with them. I write later on in the book that I go out with either of them individually, and the experience is extremely different. You know, I was very pale when I was born, and so when I was with my father, you know, I'm assuming that, you know, people just assumed that I was his white child. And so he was treated with nothing but, you know, the kind of respect, sir and mister. But with my mother, either, she was always sort of, referred to as gal or something inappropriate like that, never miss or ma'am, the proper way of addressing a young woman. Or she'd be mistaken for the maid who was taking care of me. I had a whole bank, shape of a teddy bear about this big, when I was a child, full of coins, both US coins and Canadian coins, because this happened in Canada too, that people would give my mother on the street when they saw her with me, and when she told them that I was hers and not a child she was taking care of for its white parents. The kind of, oh, such a cute little thing, too bad she's black, that I also write about in the book. This kind of strange pity and sympathy, but clearly at that point it was rooted in white Americans' knowledge of the oppression that Black Americans were going to face. That's why they felt so sorry for that poor little girl, because they knew what American racism did to Black people.
And the eraser of you wrote a beautiful poem with the line in it, again and again, my mother is assumed to be, or mistaken to, I don't want to misquote you, but assumed
Right.
or mistaken to be the maid. And this erasing of your mother is something that actually has continued into your adulthood, because you're always credited as becoming a poet because of your father. Your father was a poet and your father was a white man. And even as a child, when you were in school, people would say to you, when you did well, when you excelled, which was always, well, that's the white in you, right? So
Mm-hmm.
he was sort of credited, and then she was quite literally marginalized from the credit for having raised you. And she's and a brilliant woman raising you in a brilliant, creative way. I wonder if part of Memorial Drive, which for those of you who are just joining us, this is the book we're discussing with Natasha Trethewey. I wonder if part of that is about recentering her into the story, not just of your private life, but you're a very acclaimed public figure in America, and saying, no, you need to know about, you need to know about my mother. I won't let her be erased.
Yeah.
For her whole life, and then erased in death, and then erased in my legacy. Did you feel that as you were writing it?
Absolutely. Because it has been going on my whole life, as you point out. When people would say that, when white people would say to me, oh, that's your white side, I would be so angry. And the older I got, when I could, push back against what people were saying, they would say, oh, well, you're not like the rest of them. And I would say, well, who is the rest of them? My mother, my grandmother? How am I not like them? How is that not where everything that is good about me comes from?
Mm.
And it only got worse. And I think it gets worse, not only because of racism, but also the patriarchy. It was really easy for people to draw that through line from my white father, who was also a poet, to me becoming a poet and not knowing anything about what actually wounded me and hurt me into poetry,
Mm.
or whose language I was inhabiting, whose stories I needed to tell. And sorry.
It's no problem for me. Take your time.
So I tried to write about this in my book Thrall as well, how my mother kept being erased. She was being erased when I was written about, when my backstory came as part of the story being written about me, she would often be given a footnote as this victim or murdered woman, um, not the person who shaped me and made me who I am today. Um, and you know, my dear father participated in that a little bit too. Um, he would allow himself to say things. You know, I actually had talked about the role that he played in my life, always telling me that I should be a writer. But he then began to take a little bit more credit than he should
Mm.
for why I'm a poet. And that hurt me a lot too. Um, and so I needed to tell who my mother was so that I could tell the world the truth about her and her resilience. The resilience that I have because she left that as an inheritance.
The impression that I got of your mother from reading not only your words and the way that you spoke of her, but her words
Yeah.
um, in her diary, but most searingly in the phone conversations with your stepfather that were recorded when she was gathering evidence for the police so that they could protect her, which they ultimately failed to do. Um, I get the impression of somebody who really believed that if you could explain things um, rationally
Rationally,
and
yes.
intelligently and calmly, that everybody would be okay. And she was a social worker. She seemed to believe in human communication. And I want to go back a little bit to your grandmother, to her mother, who was a real firebrand, and by the sounds of it, um, and who tried to convince your mother to carry a gun um, to protect. Your grandmother had no illusions about the safety of
Right.
a black woman in Mississippi, and taught you also shoot to maim. Don't shoot to kill, shoot to
Right.
maim. But your mother was of a very different spirit. Your mother had a gentleness and maybe some of that idealism that
Yeah.
caused her to fall in love with your father in the first place, um, seemed to really believe, and even to the end, with your stepfather, the patience. She writes about herself in her journal that she said, "I became a master of disarming him."
Yeah.
And when I listen to those last conversations between her and him, what I see is this stark contrast between what is traditional feminine power and what is the most terrifying version of traditional masculine power.
Yeah.
And I felt overwhelmed with this sense of injustice that as powerful as she was, as diplomatic as she was, as
Yes.
intelligent as she was, in the end, she's no match for the violence that this person had within him. Um, she seemed like such an extraordinary woman. And where have you what has that formed you into? You come from an idealistic father who was raised like somebody from the Nick Adams stories in Hemingway, a mother who was
Yeah.
raised with no illusions in Mississippi, a grandmother who said carry a gun and shoot to maim.
Yeah.
Like, how does all how does all of that and and then and then this act of terrible violence? How do you navigate? Um, you seem like you straddle so many different worlds, and you navigate black worlds and white worlds, north and
Yeah.
south. You live in Chicago now, but you're from Mississippi. You're a woman. I mean, how do you move through the world with this extraordinary legacy and this extraordinary heritage?
You know, that's so lovely to think about. Isn't it lovely to think about what parts of your family members, your ancestors, you carry with you? And so when you put it that way, I think about what each of them, my grandmother, my mother, my father, said to me about how I embody characteristics of the other.
They probably, yeah,
Yeah,
they
you
probably
know,
could call you
you
out
can
on that.
imagine. So, you know, I know that I move just like my mother. I mean, even her best friend has seen so much of my mother in me. Perhaps you've had this experience of walking past a mirror and catching a look on your face that is indeed your mother's face staring back at you. I know that I have a lot of that in her. My father said my mother was sharp-tongued. Um, My mother once told me that I could tell someone I love them in a way that would make them feel the opposite. And I'm thinking, now I wonder if that's something that my father is identifying in you. Um, but I'm also, you know, my mother, um, I'm a lot like my father in that, you know, especially as a younger person growing up. And I've had wonderful conversations with Danzy Senna about this, where, you know, um, we got into fist fights long after you should be still getting into fist fights. I mean, I was sort of, I think my last one was in college. So
Whoa.
that was, that was, you know, I mean, Danzy and I have like talked about, you know, like, you know, needing to take your earrings off so you can have that fight.
Hold my earrings. Yeah.
My father was like that. My father would get into a fight for justice. One of his great stories was about, you know, he was an officer in the Canadian Navy and was sailing around the world for Canada's centennial, and they were at a port of call somewhere when it was announced on a TV in the bar that Martin Luther King Jr. had been assassinated. And there were white servicemen in the bar at the time who cheered at the news. And my father got into a fight. Of course, he would get into a fight um, because of that. Um, my mother would not get into fights. And my mother um, didn't even like the fact that my father was a boxer. My father was an amateur fighter, had fought in the Golden Gloves and continued to fight a little bit when he was in graduate school in New Orleans. But my mother was nonviolent completely. And so if I resort to fisticuffs occasionally, that's my father. But the
And a
person
little
who,
bit of your grandmother.
oh, my grandmother and my great Aunt Sugar. Now,
And great
yeah,
Aunt
because
Sugar
Aunt
too. Yeah.
Sugar, now Aunt Sugar had the sharp tongue. I think, you know, the quick wit and the sharp tongue definitely comes from Aunt Sugar. And my grandmother was extremely, extremely proud. I mean, imagine, you know, this black woman born in 1916 in
Mm,
Mississippi
mm.
and having to go through as many years in the Jim Crow South as she did. To her death, she was so upright and proud. I would have to push her around. I'd take her to the botanical gardens and I'd push her around in her wheelchair. And the set of her face was always tilted slightly up like this. Always. Dignified to the end.
Mm. Would you?
So
Oh,
I'm sorry, even as, you know, you had to witness that dissembling and oftentimes having to see the men dissemble, you know, to white men in the community. My grandmother was so head up and shoulders back.
I'm wondering if you could read us Drapery Factory.
Ah, yes.
Um, this, I think, this is well. It's hard to choose, but this is one of my favorite of your poems. And if you could give us a little introduction as to
Yes.
what it's about.
Wow, I don't even know what I'm weeping for now. Just this is just joy because I'm
Let's bring
getting
your
to talk
grandmother
to
into this space.
Yes, let's bring her.
Let's
Yes,
bring her in.
I think she will show up. She showed up with the psychic when I went to see him in the book. Okay, so this is a poem about this story that my grandmother used to tell me, which is my favorite story. She did a lot of jobs growing as a young woman, and one of them was at a drapery factory in Gulfport, Mississippi. And this was in 1956, so it's, in the aftermath of Emmett Till's murder. And, my grandmother's at this point really getting energized as an activist and trying to find ways to resist um, peaceful acts of resistance, obviously. And this one um, is one of those sort of acts of resistance that ordinary people can do that actually can make a difference. It's called Drapery Factory, Gulfport, Mississippi, 1956. She made the trip daily, though later she would not remember how far to tell the grandchildren. Better that way. She could keep those miles a secret, and her black face and black hands and the pink bottoms of her black feet a minor inconvenience. She does remember the men she worked for, and that often she sat side by side with white women, all of them bent over, pushing into the hum of the machines, their right calves tensed against the pedals. Her lips tightened, speaking of quitting time when the colored women filed out slowly to have their purses checked, the insides laid open and exposed by the boss's hand. But then she laughs when she recalls the soiled Kotex she saved, stuffed into a bag in her purse, and Adam's look on one white man's face, his hand deep in knowledge.
So
Whenever she told that story,
there.
she'd get that little wicked look in her eye and she'd say, he never checked our purses again.
He never checked. Thank you for that story. And gosh, there's so many things that come up in it too. A friend of mine, my friend Nichelle Tramble, she's a writer in Los Angeles who writes for TV, and her family's from Mississippi. And her grandmother used to call her vagina her pocketbook.
Oh yes, I've heard of that.
And it was like a fancy lady way to say,
Uh-huh.
so there's some extra level of that,
Exactly.
of both the violation
Uh-huh.
and the revenge,
Right.
and it's truly divine feminine power,
Yes,
when
absolutely.
from a person who in that culture had none,
Right.
but found some.
Yep.
Found some.
Use what your mama gave you.
Yeah. I want to talk a little bit about myth. You were raised. It sounds as though you were raised with your childhood fairy tales being much more of the mythological bent than of the Hans Christian Andersen bent.
Right.
You speak of yourself in one poem as being strapped in your car seat as a child, like Odysseus to the mast. You constantly throughout this book, and for those of you who are just joining us, we're discussing Natasha Trethewey's Memorial Drive. Myth is Greek myth, particularly runs through the entire works and all your works. Narcissus, especially, I see again and again, and Eurydice. You're reading the end of this book. You make no secret. You tell us from the beginning what it's about. We all know that this book is going to end in your mother's death, and yet it is exactly as devastating as the death of Anna Curran, when you know that that's what's coming. It doesn't matter that we know. It is so horrifying, particularly because she was so close to freedom.
Right.
And she was almost free of this man. And the police officer who was meant to be guarding her left his shift early. And it enabled your stepfather to come. And there's somebody screaming on the street in rage right now, which kind of feels appropriate
for this moment. Yeah.
For this moment. It's so funny. When I signed on to start to talk to you, the church right next to me was playing Amazing Grace, and now an enraged man is yelling, and I feel like, well, that's this book. That is this book. Amazing. If we could focus on this, what I wanted to ask you is about the role of myth in your life,
Yeah.
and and what it means to you, and particularly what the Greek myths mean to you.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, as long as I can remember, my father would tell me stories from mythology, um, and I think was using them as cautionary tales, also as a way to teach me figurative values.
Yeah.
Um, the earliest lessons were about Narcissus and not trying to not be vain and allowing vanity to rule your life. Of course, also the story of Icarus, so that I would listen to my father,
I don't
obey
think
my father.
I don't think the story of Icarus ever taught anybody to listen to their father. I think it just
And
makes
yet,
everybody want to fly.
I think, I think the two that probably mattered the most in terms of how I've sort of shaped my own grasp of the past is, the story of the myth of Cassandra. I mentioned that my father was also a writer. He was writing fiction too at the time, and in his short stories, which were, thinly veiled accounts of our actual lives, he named my character there Cassandra, and told me exactly what it meant. And so the idea that, you know,
It's quite a legacy.
you would be a prophet that no one would believe. I mean, this is something that he sort of made me uh, feel from very early on. Um, and then the story of Orpheus and Eurydice has figured in both of our lives. I mean, he's written about, is a long poem called Dreaming Eurydice that he wrote in the last years of his life, where he's imagining being able to bring my mother back himself. But yeah, that idea that knowing that myth, I think, helped me contend with grief in some ways, and to make sense of dreams that I had about her. Um, Moments where she is alive but out of reach uh, in some other worldly place.
You quote Robert Frost saying that I stepped away from my notes so we could have peace and quiet.
Yeah.
So we're in my bedroom now. You quote, so I won't get it right, but it's essentially him saying, without metaphor, we're
Yeah,
doomed.
right.
And and he says, science can't save you, history can't save you. Is that the exact line?
Well, he says if you don't have if you've not had your proper poetical education in the metaphor, if you don't
Right.
have a grasp of figurative values, you're not safe in science, you're not safe in history.
That's it. You're not safe in science, you're not safe in history. Yeah.
Because metaphors are everywhere around us, and we need to know how to parse them and make sense of them, or we can't survive them.
Can I tell you a story?
Yeah.
Okay, so I went to Greece several years ago with my mom, and I hate not being able to read things. I get frustrated in countries with different alphabets because I even if I can't understand what the words mean, I want to be able to say them. So I decided to learn the Greek alphabet before I went, so that I could say, so that which is simple because it's not, ours is very similar to it.
I tried to teach it to myself when I was a small child.
Yeah. Okay, so this is a nerd meet nerd moment,
Yep.
and this is my idea of fun on vacation, is to learn Greek alphabet, and your idea of fun as a child is to teach it yourself. So we really, we really are siblings here
Yes,
in the nerd
yes.
world. And then I drove my mom crazy by spelling out and sounding out everything that I saw as we were driving around Greece. And we were with a tour guide one day, and we drove. There was a big truck, tractor trailer truck, driving by us on a highway in Athens. And I spelled out the word that was on the side of it in huge letters, and spelled it out slowly: metaphore,
Ah,
metaphor. And I said, metaphor? I said, and our you'll like this. Our guide's name was Paris.
ah.
Um, and going back to our mythology, and I said to Paris, "Does that say metaphor?" And he said yes. And I said, "Is that a giant truck filled with metaphors? What is that? Like, what is it? Who's shipping metaphors across seas?"
Yeah.
And he said, "No, metaphor is the Greek word for transportation." And I never knew that that's what a metaphor was.
Either. Right.
It's something that transports you. And then I noticed it on my plane ticket in Greek. I noticed it in my train ticket that I was being moved through metaphor
Yeah.
from one place to another.
Right.
And I was so excited by that, and finding out
I
what that is.
love that.
And I wonder how writing this book and finding those metaphors, finding the mythological through lines in this, finding you're such a historian as a writer, as well as you're such a deep researcher. Your work is grounded in such scholarship, and you reference everything in your work, from E.J. Belloc's photographs to Vermeer to Nina Simone to to the ancient Greeks. I mean, you're all over the place. And in writing this book particularly, do you feel that it moved you, that it transported you from one psychic or emotional or spiritual place to another, as a truck full of metaphors might be able to do?
Yeah, yeah. Yes. You know, one of the stories that I tell in the book, it has to do with that idea of metaphor and transport. And this is a very early photograph of me with my parents. Well, they're there. It's just the photograph is only of me sitting on a mule in Mexico in 1969. Um, and the idea of the very racialized joke that is inherent in that image, the mixed race child, the mulatto child, riding her namesake, the mule, which is uh, a cross between a horse and a donkey. But that I'm on it, it represented to me two different ways that my parents thought about the necessity for a grasp in one's education. And my father, if he could laugh at the idea of that, my mother was much more aware of what it meant to be bound to
Mm,
metaphorical language, but also the possibility of being transported by it.
mm,
So, a perfect example is of how I had to both shift from what the literal idea of something to the figurative idea of something. Um, my father also told me that, Natasha, means Christmas child. So I had, and this idea of the Christmas child, of course, Jesus and the 33rd year. I mean, my father talked about the 33rd year, and that number just, stuck out to me as like, okay, so 33 is a big deal. I can't watch, for example, the stories about the dead now from COVID-19 without paying close attention to the ones who were 33
mm,
when it happened. But this idea being of 33, so my whole 33rd year, I was uh, only thinking literally that somehow I was not going to survive it. And
mm,
I think I also thought that because you begin to think you're on borrowed time, the closer you get to, and particularly after being older than a parent ever was.
Right.
And so, I was consumed with the idea that I wouldn't make it past my 33rd year. But then when I did, and not long after that, I ended up going to Greece and meeting a Greek poet who told me that Natasha means resurrection
Huh.
in
Of
Greek.
course it does.
So I had been thinking this whole time literal death as opposed to figurative resurrection.
A
And it's
considerable difference.
a considerable difference. Yeah. And
Wow.
why the figurative and our grasp of it matters. And so your question was about, what transport happened for me in writing this book. And I think so much of it was about being able to grasp the figurative import of my life, which uh, is something that propels me forward like a resurrection and not stops me like a death.
I'm going to move back into the other room.
Yeah.
I think it's gotten quiet out on the streets. Thank you for that. I heard an interview with you on NPR years ago in what I think we can safely call a happier time.
Yeah.
It was on around the time of Obama's election.
Uh-huh.
A very different moment than this moment. And you were being interviewed by Terry Gross about, that like Obama, like at that point, our new president, that you were the product of a mixed race marriage, and what did that mean? And you were speaking about that. And there's a moment in it that just brought tears to my eyes, because things are so bad now that it's
Yeah.
almost like we've forgotten what this moment felt like. But you said, um, Terry Gross said, if your mother was alive now and could see that Barack Obama was just elected president of the United States, what would she say? And you said, I want to find, this is why I
Oh,
came back
what
in the
did I
room. I
say?
wanted to find it. Let me see if I can find it in my notes. I have so many notes I can't find it. Well, how about this? I'll ask you directly what she would have said about Obama being elected, and then what you think she might have said about this very different and much more sinister moment that we're in right now as a country. And which moment would have surprised her more, or would either of them have surprised her at all?
That's exactly what I was thinking. That seems like the answer that I have closer in mind right now.
Mm-hmm.
I can't remember what I said then. I think she would have been surprised by it, but I think she'd probably be more surprised by where we find ourselves now. And I think that's because, there was such a great hopefulness that people like my mother and my father had in the 60s for um, the changes that were being wrought in the nation. Um, that it looked as if the nation were really moving closer uh, consciously toward realizing its founding ideals. Um, that moral universe was indeed bending toward justice. And I think to see such virulent and vocal and visible forms of white supremacy and white nationalism um, would be utterly surprising. That we could have gone as far as we did, only to take so many more steps backwards. It's the backwards motion of it is stunning.
I've heard you say that both white Mississippi and black Mississippi have always known this. Um, and that you said it in response to, I think, what we can call sort of a white innocent response this year of like, what? There's
Yeah.
so much racism in this country, you know?
Like, who didn't know that?
Clutch your pearls, you know. Wait, this is still happening. People, you know, this is still occurring. And you said, you know, white Mississippi knows this and black Mississippi knows this. And now I think the whole country, you have to know it now.
Yeah.
You know, the log has been kicked over, and you can really see the disease
Yep.
at the root of all of this. There's your mother at one point considered moving to Canada with your father, but wrote that my country needs me. Not even my country, she said my state. Mississippi needs me. This would have been in 1966 or 1967. That broke my heart to read too, because of course all I want reading the story is for her to go, is for her to run and to run away from the destiny that was waiting for her. And you know, to get free and to go to Canada, which is so much better. I wonder if you have a sense, you have served this country as our poet laureate for 2 terms, and you were the poet laureate of Mississippi. Do you have a sense of your country and your state needing you, or has your family given enough? And maybe do you want to run away to Canada with me? I'm just curious what you feel about that at this moment.
You know, sometimes it just feels like you know, when I wrote Native Guard, thinking about historical memory and erasure and Confederate monuments and the ways that what it meant to be both wounded deeply by my home state and in a larger sense my native land, you know, my country. There was a moment that you could feel like that's obsolete because we're done with it. We can move on now. And yet, all of those things have bubbled to the surface now and are more pertinent for us to think about national memory and national amnesia more than ever before, because our future is at stake. Um, you know, my friend Kevin Young used to tease me a long time ago because I probably talk about sort of racial injustice and social justice and inequality in Mississippi and all this so much. He used to call me a militant mulatto, and it was affectionate. But, you know, but there it was. It's like Cassandra like, you know, the prescience. It hasn't gone away. It's something I've been talking about for years. And I guess I have to stay here and keep talking about it, and be part of the people who are doing what we can to make sure this country continues to move toward and not away from its founding ideals.
Your book, Memorial Drive, begins with a dream that you have of your mother where she says to you, do you know what it is to have a wound that never heals? And you circle back around to that at the end of the book, quoting Lorca, speaking about how it is precisely the wound that never heals that creates art. And in trying to heal the wound that never heals lies this strangeness that drives us into our creative lives. You weren't born to be a poet because your father told you that you were going to be a poet. You were born to you became a poet. You were forged. Mississippi made you into a poet, and your mother's death made you into a poet. And this moment in history is keeping you in your poetry. You know, the wounds have made that. Yesterday, when we spoke, you spoke of a woman leaving a review on Amazon saying something like, "There's no hope in this book," or "There's no," and I disagree. I think this is a book that's about not necessarily closing, but looking at the wounds that have still not healed. And I think that this country is a little bit obsessed. Americans are so uncomfortable with discomfort.
Yes.
We're a little bit obsessed with healing wounds rather than cleaning them out.
Right.
Looking at them, addressing them, and discussing them. I think your book is enormously courageous because in it you look at the great unhealed wound of your own heart and your own personal life, and also the great unhealed wound of America's violent and savage racial history that is still violent and savage.
Right.
And I wonder how you respond when people want you. I was talking about this the other day with my friend Antoinette, and I was saying I've only recently become aware of what I can only call the violence of hope, which is when particularly a white person says to a Black American, give me some hope. What are we hopeful about? Where are the, give me something to feel good about. Because
Yeah.
I don't want to be in the amount of discomfort that I don't want to have to feel this. And I'm realizing that there's a sort of a violence to wanting everything to be tidied up, and wanting everything to be cleaned and fixed and healed. And maybe some of the naivete that I felt on Obama's election night was, well, that's settled, like, great, done. The good guys won. That's the end. I just want to commend you. I don't suppose that I even have a question in there other than to say the mantle that you carried from the beginning with your father of calling you Cassandra, and the work that you've continued to do is about not reaching for cheap hope, but telling painful truths, both on the personal level and on the historical level. And I guess what I'm just saying is thank you for what that must cost you to do. And if I do have a question, it might be, what has that been like for you to hold that place in our culture?
What you said is exactly right. And I face it so much, people saying things like that to me. In Mississippi, you will hear people constantly saying, we need to not open old wounds. Why are you going to open these old wounds? And the idea of that, what's problematic, as you've said, is that the wounds aren't actually healed. It's not that somehow we've managed to keep them clean and therefore they've healed. They've just festered, and all we've done is kept a filthy bandage on top of it. Which is why, I cleave to, Rumi's, the wound is the place where the light enters you. That is where the possibility of our salvation is as a nation, in recognizing the wound and letting light get into it, as opposed to keeping it wrapped in filthy rags, as we've done for so long. I gave a reading once, and someone came up to me afterwards and said, I was reading from Native Guard too. Came up to me and said, do you have any hope? And this has become a joke with some of my friends. We treat each other like, no, you don't have any hope, do you? I wanted to say, the poem, when you make art about something, no matter how difficult or tragic it may be, the poem still says, I am still here. I can make something generative out of this. That's the most hopeful act there is. We can't look for hope in silly, easy places, but we can look for hope in the fact that we can still be here to do something. And, I was thinking about this too. I say this in my book, do I really believe it? I think I do. The power of being able to tell these stories has saved me. What could be more hopeful than that?
Natasha Trethewey, I don't want to add anything to what you just said, other than thank you. Thank you for sharing your life with us and this hour with me and with this beautiful community. We love you.
Thank you.
We're grateful. And I'm going to put the comments back on for just one tiny second. because I know that everybody is going to want to just shower you with love. I don't know if you can, I know you're not familiar with Instagram Live, but all those little hearts piling up in the corner, do you see those? Each one of
That's
those is a human
lovely.
being
Oh,
letting you know,
many
like,
hearts,
there they are.
many
Yeah.
hearts.
Every single one of those is a person just saying thank you. And
It's lovely.
we
I want
hold
to
you in
thank
the highest
you.
regard.
Thank
My,
you
my
for
pleasure.
your brilliance and for using your talent and your platform to bring attention to so many writers and so many important issues that we need to be talking about.
Thank you, Natasha.
Thank you.
I won't stop.
Don't ever stop.
I
That
won't.
gives me hope.
I won't. Thank you, and thank you all so much for joining us. The book, once more, is Memorial Drive by Natasha Trethewey. I know that's going to come up backwards on your screens, but you're clever. You can sort it out. I would also very much recommend that you treat yourself to her poetry. A good place to start is with this book, Monument. It's a collection, so you can sort of move through Natasha's life with her over the years. And I just can't thank you enough for being with us today. And all the best to everybody. Take care of your hearts. And this is a marathon, not a sprint. And so let's keep going. Okay. Lots of love to you, Natasha.
Love to you. Thank you.